Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of the Triangle Area SQL Server User Group's Advanced DBA meeting. And we have with us tonight the one and only Jes Chapman, who is going to talk to us about Azure SQL Security, specifically using Azure RBAC, Entra ID, and SQL Authentication. So please, Jes, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. And thank you, everyone who has taken some time out of your day to join me. I was telling Kevin it's such a nice day here in Louisville that I actually ducked out of work a little bit, took a bike ride, and then came back to my computer. So what we are here to talk about today, one of the pillars of what I will refer to as the Azure well-architected framework, and that is security. In particular, how you can manage both layers of your Azure SQL estate, the control plane and the data plane. So for those of you that I have not met yet, so my name is Jes Chapman. Some of you may recognize me as previously Jess Schultz. So yes, my name has changed. I got married on June 1st of this year. So I am still working at Microsoft as a data and AI cloud solution architect. So this kind of thing is stuff that I do all day, help customers build solutions in Azure, make them realize that well-architected framework pillars help them solve problems like this. As I mentioned, I'm based in Louisville, Kentucky. When I am not working, I am often running or hiking or making or eating food. You can connect with me on Blue Sky as Girl Geek. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. And you can also check my GitHub repo. I keep a lot of my presentation slides and scripts out there, and I will make sure that these get uploaded before the end of the week so you can have them for reference. So again, as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing today on one of the primary 5 pillars from the Azure well-architected framework. Anytime we go to build a solution in Azure, we should be looking at all 5 of these pillars. Again, your reliability, your security, your cost optimization, your operational excellence, your performance efficiency. Adding a layer in one will always have trade-offs. There are always decisions to be made, but all of these things have to be considered. When we're talking about the security within Azure, we always think about what we call the control plane, but there's a special case with a lot of our data stores, whether that's Azure SQL database, SQL managed instance, a SQL VM, or even another data store like Postgres or MySQL or Cosmos DB. And what we're dealing with for all of these data solutions is having to work with both our control plane and our data plane. These two things have two different authorization mechanisms, different authentication methods, and they control very different aspects of your Azure services. So to try to take a step back, let's just look at, to begin with, what the control plane is. So the control plane is the fundamental Azure Resource Manager. It's the underlying APIs that let you do things in Azure itself. So this could be in the context of our databases in particular, creating new resources like a logical SQL server, a SQL database, an elastic pool, a managed instance. It is anything then after creation that involves editing it. This could be changing network settings, adding firewall rules, making private endpoints. It could be scaling your database or instance up or down. It could be failing databases between failover groups or promoting geo-replicated secondaries. all of the control plane actions and your ability to do those things is controlled through RBAC, role-based access control, which we'll talk about here quite a bit on another slide. Now, once you have your permissions to do things in Azure itself, on top of that, for our databases, we're going to have the data plane. So the data plane is the database and its contents itself. These are something that are controlled separately by whatever database engine you're using. In this case, again, we'll be focusing on Azure SQL Database and SQL Managed Instance. A lot of these concepts apply to things like Postgres and MySQL, but are handled slightly differently there. So when you have access to the data plane and permissions to and authorization in the data plane, this is when you're going to do things like be able to connect to a database, be able to run DDL or DML statements, right? Run a select statement, create a stored procedure, alter columns, whatever you want to do inside the database. There's levels for creating users in the databases, changing database level settings like a compatibility level or max stop. So all of this takes place separate from that Azure control plane and is handled through different authentication methods, primarily either SQL authentication or the artist previously known as Azure Active Directory, which has been renamed to Entra ID Authentication, and I still call it Active Directory in my mind every time. And so we're going to go through in this next 50 minutes or so and talk about, again, what each of these things control, how they overlap, how they don't, and how you can most securely set up your environments. One of the things that we always want to be looking at, especially with our data, right? Because a company's data is the most important thing. It is the company's currency nowadays. So we want to set up anything we can with the principle of least permissions. We always want to have, as little trust as possible. How do we give people the absolute bare minimum permissions that they need to do their job rather than just giving them, full admin access and everything? I did tell Kevin at the beginning, I do love questions, especially presenting virtually. I'm just talking to my screen right now. So if you do have questions, please pop them in chat. Kevin will very much let me know and we'll chat about it. All right, so let's talk about our control plane. So again, this is so when you log into Azure, whether you do this through the Azure portal, through the Azure CLI, using ARM API, REST API calls, you're going to be authenticating using your Entra ID authentication. Once you get past that initial authorization, then you're into Azure, and everything you do with Azure resources is controlled through RBAC. Again, role-based access control. So a few things of note about RBAC. This covers every Azure resource. So this is not just for all of the scale up and scale down and creation and editing of SQL database or SQL MI. The same thing applies to, the same concepts apply to storage accounts, Azure App Services and functions. It would apply to stream analytics. It would apply to, an open AI model. So these concepts of RBAC and the different RBAC roles we'll talk about, those are things that are spread across all of our Azure resources. So it's always based on security principles and roles. Again, mostly based on Azure, not Active Directory, Entra ID. So the permissions that we're granting, we can grant to either groups or we can grant it to users as usual. Groups are preferred rather than managing, hundreds or thousands of individual users at any resource level. We can set Azure RBAC scope at a variety of levels. I'll show some examples of that. You have everything from a subscription level to a resource group level down to individual resources. And note that permissions are inherited. So we start at the, again, big bucket here is the subscription. A subscription can have multiple resource groups. A resource group can have multiple resources. If you give someone a high-level permission at the subscription, you're giving them high-level permission to everything within that subscription. Same with a resource group. If you give someone a high-level permission at a resource group, they have permission to every resource within that resource group. So again, principle of least permission applies. If you are ever in charge of setting up RBAC permissions for any of the items surrounding your SQL Server, SQL managed instances, be aware of what RBAC roles are being created around those. Again, subscriptions and resource groups, understanding who or what groups have access to those items. Again, this is completely separate from any SQL logins, SQL users that you have. This merely gives the rights to do the Azure functions. As I mentioned, it applies to anything in which you log into Azure, whether that's the portal, the CLI, token authentication through the REST API. By being able to give these varying levels of resource permissions across these different resources, which again can be inherited or not, separation of duties, principle of least permissions. This is definitely something that when you're, especially if you're standing up a new subscription, so standing up a new resource group, standing up a new application with a database in Azure, something to step back initially and take a look at as part of your design. Who has which access? Why? How can we more tightly scope that? Another Azure feature that I always mention in conjunction with any security topic I'm talking about, and in particular when talking about users and their ability to do things, then is going to be Azure locks. So an Azure lock can be set, again, at any level, an individual resource, a resource group, or a subscription. There are two different types of locks. So we can have deletion locks or we can have change locks. If you apply a delete lock on a subscription, on a resource group, on an item within a resource group like a SQL Server, this is really important for SQL servers and SQL managed instances, no one can come in and delete that item. Even the highest level admin, which is an owner. If anyone tries to do that, doesn't matter what level of permissions they have, it says, you can't do this. There is a lock on this resource. And someone with high enough permissions to undo a lock, like a subscription owner, has to go in, manually remove that. Then you can remove your resource, and then they hopefully reapply the lock. The change lock is the same thing, but even more restrictive in that nothing about the resource could be changed without someone with either high enough permissions or that owner going in and changing that. So just quick takeaway, completely separate from authentication, but I'm going to go off on this tangent anyway. When you create your Azure SQL servers, those logical SQL servers, highly recommend putting delete locks on those resources. Same thing with SQL managed instances. Highly recommend putting delete locks on those resources. You don't want someone to delete your server, and that would delete all of the databases that are associated with it and the backups that are associated with those databases, and just have this cascading snowball of failures. All right, so that's kind of my high-level talk on just what RBAC is and why it's important. So digging into it now, within Azure itself, there are 4 built-in primary roles that apply across all resources, no matter what they are, whether they're a subscription, whether they're a SQL database, again, whether it's a storage account, whether it's a analysis services database. So the top highest performer here, the admin level, truly is the owner. So an Azure RBAC owner will have the full access to manage all resources at whatever level they're given. So that could be the subscription level, that could be the resource group, that could be the resource itself. The owner, in addition to being able to do anything, create, delete, edit, scale, also has the ability to assign other users and groups roles in RBAC. So owner has full create, edit, delete permissions and security permissions. Owner should always be very tightly scoped to a very limited group of people. The next level down is the Azure contributor role. So contributor gives you access to manage all of the resources in terms of like those CRUD operations. And the differentiator here is a contributor does not have the ability to assign other users or groups RBAC roles. Now, the RBAC, so then that leads into a third built-in role, the RBAC admin. So this is a user or group that has access within the resource to assign roles for RBAC, but cannot do anything else related to the resources. They don't have permissions to do Azure policies. They're not going to have permissions to scale your resources, that sort of thing. And last but not least, a common role you might find yourself in if you're an Azure user, like myself in most Microsoft subscriptions, is a reader. This is a user that at, again, subscription level, resource group level, can view the resources if they're given access to that sub or that resource group, but they're not allowed to make any changes. So these are, again, the 4 basic Azure RBAC roles. Now, one other thing that you can do is you can create custom roles. That's a little outside the scope of this topic at the Azure level. We'll talk more about it in terms of the SQL level, but that can also be done. So let's take a look at kind of what this might look like in reality. So let's say that we work for the Acme Resource Company, and we have set up our first Azure subscription for our development environment, and it's called Acme Dev US. Within that resource group, within that subscription, then let's say that we have 2 resource groups, Dev East and Dev West. And within each of those resource groups, we have 2 SQL servers. Now, we're going to have multiple users at our company that are going to get different permissions here. So let's say that we have Davide, who's one of our IT administrators, particularly cloud administrators. He has been put into the Azure RBAC role of subscription owner. Davide and anyone else in this role are able to do things like create and delete resources. So Davide could create a new resource group. He could also, if a lock did not exist, delete a resource group and poof, all of its resources are gone. He could create virtual machines. He can scale databases up and down. He can create networking. He can do anything that he wants to do. Now, Another one of our users is Amara. Amara works on our security team. So she's been granted the security admin role, or the RBAC admin role. So her team's job is, as more subscriptions are brought online and more resource groups are brought online, they're going to be determining which groups have access to which resources. So she's able to do things like create new RBAC roles. She can assign users to those roles. And again, anyone else with this RBAC admin role, anyone on her team could also review permissions, review audit logs within Azure. This team does not have access to, again, create new resource groups, create new resources. In this scope, their permissions are limited to the security aspect of it. Now, let's say that we also have Kevin. And I promise I made this presentation and named Kevin long before Kevin was my moderator here tonight. But Kevin, I hope you feel welcome here. So Kevin is on our data administrator team. In this case, at the subscription level and at the resource group level, so let's just say he's blue, right? So that means that at the subscription level, Kevin doesn't have access. And that's possible. Like, you can be given access to something and you won't be able to view information about the subscription if you go to like the subscription blade in Azure. Instead, he's made a reader at the resource group level. So what he can do for each of these two resource groups, he could go in and see there are SQL servers, and he could see their configurations, their networking rules, that sort of thing. He can see if virtual machines exist. He could see if storage accounts exist. He can view activity logs for the resource group. But he cannot create or modify or delete or start or stop or do anything with the resources themselves. So now, before we go too much farther, I'm going to pop over and share, I think, yep, just a quick view of what this actually looks like in Azure. If you've never looked at this and haven't had the pleasure of figuring this out. So I've logged into the Azure portal. And where I'm going to start is the subscriptions that I have access to. Now, one of these is my own Microsoft subscription. And you'll notice that if I come to this blade here, the access control or IAM blade, this is where we will see permissions, change permissions, be able to modify things if we have that kind of access. So what I can do here for any resource I can see in Azure, I can come to access control, check access, and I can say, view my access. Now, this is going to be a gimme for me because I am an owner in this subscription. So as it says, full access to manage all resources. Let's move this over, including the ability to assign roles in Azure RBAC. So I am an owner. I can check access for other users as well by clicking check access. I have a coworker named Jared, and I believe that I've given Jared some permissions in this subscription. I've not. All right, let's keep that in mind. So that's, again, at the subscription level. So at the subscription level, I'm going to go into role assignments then. Role assignments for this subscription. There are, let's see, who has ownership? Some different service principals. Oh, Kevin Williamson, a couple of groups, and that's it. There's some reader permissions, again, for service principals and groups. But really, I am the only user, along with Kevin, that has owner permissions. So these are how you can check things at any resource level. We're just starting at the subscription level. Now we could also go and dig into a resource group. So as I mentioned, I have this resource group called Acme Dev US. I actually did set that up just like that. And again, here at this, so you'll see my resource group has all sorts of different resources in it. SQL databases, Cosmos DB, virtual networks. Again, if I come to access control, because I'm a subscription owner, I should have owner rights in this resource group, and that holds true. Now I can go to view access to this resource, right? It takes me to role assignments, and I can see what else. So here, owners, let's see, same users again. Let's check readers. Oh, so here is where we can see now that we have some other access. So at this resource group level, my coworker, Jared Carney, is a reader. So this means that Jared can come log into the subscription. He would see this resource group and he would see the other resources that exist, but he's not able to change them around like I am. And the rest are all security related. All right, so that is what it looks like, again, from just kind of a pure Azure RBAC all up level. Kevin, have there been any questions thus far?
So far, there have not been any questions, but chat,
Okay.
if there are any questions, get them in there and I will ask away.
Okay, yeah. So that, again, Azure RBAC roles. Now, that does not, again, that is the general all up Azure resources RBAC. But there are also specific roles created for different Azure resources. So there are 4 Azure SQL specific RBAC roles. There are Azure RBAC roles for Cosmos. There's RBAC roles for, again, storage accounts, for functions, for anything you can think of. So the 4 Azure SQL RBAC roles that are predefined. So here you have SQL Server contributor. So a SQL Server contributor, again, manages the logical SQL Server construct, its databases, its elastic pools. A SQL Server contributor cannot, by default, access the databases that are within that, right? Remember, we have 2 separate planes here, data plane or control plane and data plane. And we're talking purely at the Azure control plane. They also can't access the security policies. Again, to do things like assign people to users, to assign people to roles or create other roles. So the SQL Server contributor, again, this can manage, meaning create, delete, scale, change networking, view performance of the SQL Server and its associated databases. You may not want some users to have access to everything at that logical SQL Server level, particularly if you have shared SQL servers. You might not want one app dev team to be able to go in and remove the networking settings that another one needs. So you can also have a SQL database contributor. So a SQL DB contributor, again, can manage the SQL database. This is things like creating, scaling, viewing performance metrics in the portal. Again, by default, they don't have access to the databases. They cannot manage anything related to security, and they cannot manage the SQL servers. So in setting up anything with SQL database, be aware of whether you want your users to be SQL Server or SQL database level contributors. You also have a separate RBAC for managed instance. So SQL managed instance, you have a contributor role there that allows you to manage at that instance level, and also its many networking settings. So the SQL MI contributor role is a little bit different in that there's a lot of networking things relegated, but again, cannot give access to others. And last but not least, the SQL Security Manager. So this is someone that, or this role would be someone that cannot access databases, again, by default, cannot scale them, cannot change them, but can manage any of the security policies. So let's look at what that looks like in real life again. So let's go from that subscription that had multiple resource groups in it and delve into our, like, what one of those resource groups would look like with our same 3 employees that we were talking about earlier. So Davide is still the subscription owner, which means he has owner rights in this resource group and on all of the resources in it. So again, he could create and delete the resources. He can create RBAC roles. He can assign users to roles. He can do anything and everything except, again, by default, Davide and the IT admin group do not have access to the databases themselves. So our security admin, Amara, we have, in addition to giving her the RBAC admin role at the subscription level, she's also been given in this resource group the SQL Security Administrator RBAC role. So this allows this group to do things like create and manage the audits at the SQL Server level and change advanced threat protection settings for servers or for databases. Those are some of the things that are part of the SQL Security Administrator. And last but not least, Kevin, who is part of our database admin group. Remember, at the resource group level, Kevin has reader access. So when he logs into this resource group, he can see the resources. He could click on some of them and view their configurations, but he cannot change anything about it. But within the SQL servers themselves, he has been given both SQL Server contributor and SQL database contributor rights. We want our data admins, not our app admins, our data admins to be able to control both the SQL and database and Elastic Pool settings. So here he can create new SQL servers. He can manage their settings. He could delete SQL servers unless they have locks on them. If you take nothing else away from this session, you know that locks are important. He could also create, scale, and delete SQL databases. He can edit audit settings at both, again, server and database level because he has rights on both of those. He can read any metrics. He could even do things like go in and edit data masking on a database. Now, you might ask yourself, Jess, how do you know exactly what rights all of these different roles have? I should have had this pulled up already. Let me go back to my slide. As with all things in Azure, there is a doc for that, but I just need to turn my little laser pointer off. So let's take a look at the documentation. I want to show this also because it can be confusing to try to figure out what some of this stuff means and how to navigate this documentation if it ever opens. There we go. Now it's going to open 7 times, such is my luck. All right, so the Azure built-in roles, as I mentioned, there are the general roles of contributor, owner, reader, RBAC admin. If we click into any one of these, like contributor, you're going to see that these are the actions and what it describes that they can do. So again, for the contributor, they can have right to create roles and role assignments. They can do things in Microsoft Purview. Owners, as you'll see, it just says star. They can do everything. Readers, again, they have read access to everything. Now, if we want to go and look more specifically at other Azure resource types, again, like I said, there's groups for everything, compute or virtual machines. They have, 25, 26. Storage has even more. So if we go to databases, we can scope that down here and see there are specific roles for, again, SQL, Cosmos, Redis. If we look at any one of these, so if we want to see exactly what you can do as a SQL DB contributor, this is where you can see things like Microsoft resources / deployments, right? So this means we can create, we can edit, we can delete. It allows you to, again, have access to Microsoft.SQL / server / databases. So create and manage SQL databases. Read the metrics of things. There are also some things here that might be useful for you if you're looking through not actions. What are things that this user or this group does not get to do? So a contributor, again, no access to things in managed instances. Again, they don't have access to auditing settings. They don't have access to security metrics or sensitivity labels. So there is a list in documentation of all of the things that these roles can and cannot do. One of the other things that you will have the ability to do, again, so at this resource group level, if I go to access control and I need custom permissions, I can create custom roles. I actually had not had to do this up until the last year because I have never really been an Azure admin, right? I've always been a data admin, someone that's helped with different aspects of the SQL security, but I was helping a customer with their SQL databases, and they wanted to enable certain things about their point-in-time retention and their long-term retention, and the SQL Server contributor role was too loose, but the SQL database contributor role was too tight, and so we ended up making a custom role for them. You can add permissions. Yeah, I won't go into the full scope of this, but you, again, have the ability, if needed, to create specific rules to create specific tasks and really scope it down. Again, if I search for SQL, I can get the Microsoft SQL database, right? So this gives me all of the actions that are even possible in SQL. And I can choose whether this role has explicit permission to do it or has explicit permission to not do it. So that's cool to me. All right. So I've shown you a little bit of that, and let's check it out. I've been showing that. That's the control plane. So remember, this is everything on the Azure side. This is the subscriptions, the resource groups, the servers, the databases. This has to do with the creation, the scaling, the security of that. And separately then, we also have our data plane. So our SQL managed instance, our SQL logical server, our SQL database. Before I dig into this, Kevin, any questions?
No questions. Comment from Anders in chat that you're explaining too well, so he doesn't even have any questions for you.
Okay, I will try to not do that, but all right. So data plane. So once we want to get to the actual SQL database, we have to take a couple of steps. So first, you have options. You can set up either SQL authentication, or you can set up Entra ID authentication, or you can do a mixed mode. So not all that different from SQL Server itself. So the steps that you take. So the first thing is obviously to deploy the logical SQL Server for SQL databases or deploy the SQL managed instance. And that server level has to have at least one administrator. Again, this can be a SQL administrator. It can be a SQL user. It could be an Entra user. You can have one of each. Then that admin has the ability to create other server level administrative accounts and other server level accounts. They also have the ability to create database users as well. And then after you have your server level admin, any other admins you need, any other server level roles you need, then you have database level users that you need. Then you can grant permissions to objects within the database to those users. So again, you are given the option of SQL or Entra ID authentication. We should be using Entra ID authentication by default. Even Microsoft recommends Entra ID authentication only, right? This means that you have password policies and password rotation and password management in one place, and that's Entra ID. With Entra ID, if you lose a password or forget a password, it's easy to reset it. Users can even reset their own. There's multiple forms of authentication, multi-factor authentication, token-based authentication, all sorts of things, and the ability to put users into groups and give groups access. So you don't have in 2 years 40 users in your SQL database, and you're wondering what do these users do when you're at an enterprise of thousands of people. It's a lot easier to go into a database, look at the roles and say, oh, SQL backup admins, and think, I have an idea of what that group might do, or app admins, or app readers, right? That's a lot easier to figure out than who are these 20 people. 10 of them no longer seem to have access at the company, but are those users or are those applications? And are those applications still using this, right? It's this constant battle that we have had as SQL admins for years. So Entra ID authentication is preferred. And in addition to just the users, the actual people that bang on keyboards here, you and I, the application developers, the system admins, applications themselves, right? Instead of giving an app a username and a password and passing that in a connection string, applications can have a service principal or a managed identity, which is like just a number, a random GUID generated by Entra ID with all of the correct permissions, and then you can give that service principal or managed identity permissions within the database. Again, no passwords to pass, nothing in connection strings. For any new development in particular, right, please enforce with your users, with your application teams, that using Entra authentication is the preferred method. I'll step off that soapbox now. And let's talk about that configuration of logins and users and how this is sometimes similar to what you might do in SQL Server, either on-prem or in a cloud VM, and how it can be a little bit different. So let's actually start on this right-hand side with SQL Managed Instance, because again, this is more similar to the actual SQL Server. So again, you're going to define either a top level SQL authentication admin or a top level Entra ID admin, or one of each. So this user is going to have full admin permissions. They are added to the sysadmin role within the instance, and they are matched to each database's DBO user. After that, other server level logins can be created, and that they can either have those sysadmin privileges or be lower. And other database users then, again, depending on what's enabled, SQL auth, Entra ID auth, or both can be created. So note, SQL Managed Instance does support contained databases. So your server, your instance level logins can be users in the database, but they don't have to be, and vice versa. You can have contained users within your databases, both Entra and or SQL if needed, but they don't have to exist at the instance level. Now, let's compare that a little bit, or let's compare and contrast that to the SQL database model. So at deployment time, again, you're going to specify the SQL Server admin, whether that's SQL auth username and password or Entra ID. So they have full admin permissions as on the databases. Again, there's no concept of a sysadmin role in the logical SQL Server and SQL database because they're just contained databases. So for every SQL database on a logical SQL server, the SQL admin, this top level admin, does become a member of DB owner. Again, you can create other server level logins. They can have admin permissions or they can be lower. And they can then create other database users. So again, here with SQL database, contained databases, you can have a login at the server level and then a user in one or more databases that are related, or you can have just purely contained database users. Let me just take a quick pop into what that looks like here, the whole admin portion of it. And I realize I don't have Management Studio started, so let me get that rocking and rolling in the background. So let's say in our resource group here. So I have a logical SQL Server. And if I come to the settings and look at the properties, this is where it will tell me my server admin login. In this case, I do have a SQL Authentication login set up. I created it with the name SQL admin. I also have a Microsoft Entra admin, which is me, my email address. Same thing can be said for a managed instance, which I probably won't be able to show you because my managed instance should not be running for the time being to save me some money. We'll see. Yeah, it's not running. But if we were to come to the SQL managed instance properties, we would see exactly the same thing. The SQL admin if we've created it, and then the Entra admin if we've created it. When we're going and we're creating a new resource, the screen could use about 6 less clicks, I'll be honest. So let's say we go into Azure SQL, go to create something. create a database. All right. When we go to use our server, if we want to create a new server, this is where it will ask us here. Do you want to use Entra only authentication, SQL and Entra, or just SQL? Again, if you can just use Microsoft Entra only authentication, most secure, recommended, obviously set by default nowadays. So let's take a look at what that might look like from the database level. I'll give that while we're connecting and hoping SSMS connects. I have been moving around a lot the last couple of days, and so I've gotten lots of, or the last couple of weeks, so I've gotten lots of, your IP address is not valid. So one thing to note is, because with the SQL Server and SQL database methodology, remember, no sysadmin role exists. Other, like typical SQL Server and SQL managed instance level roles don't exist. So SQL database has created some special roles at this logical SQL Server level to help you meet the needs of your management without just giving everyone admin permissions. So there's a database manager role. This is a group or user that can create and delete databases. If it creates databases, it becomes the owner and it has DBO permissions. You could also assign a group or a user to be a login manager. This login manager creates and deletes logins in the master database. So, have one admin that very few, one group with very limited permissions. You could have a login manager to manage your permissions, and then a different, database manager group for anyone that just needs to create, edit, delete those databases. There's also a role called the database connector. So if you would create a login at the server level and put it in the database connector role, it grants it connect permissions to all of the databases that are attached to that server, rather than having to go in and create all of those setups individually. So let's see what we've got over here in Management Studio. Okay, so on this 49 East US, I have several databases. Some of them are serverless, which is what I'm trying to connect to. So under security and logins, I'm trying to make Management Studio really work. Every time I start this presentation, I think, I just don't know. I think maybe 30 minutes of content, maybe 40. And then we get here where I've been talking for 50 minutes. And I think, yep, I can always talk about this topic. Okay, so let's look at our list of what we have here as SQL logins at our server level. So we have one called SQL admin. That's obviously that top level admin we had. I have a login called commerce admin, and that will be tied to these 3 commerce databases that I have. I also have logins for database watcher, but let's compare and contrast that then to this master database that I have. So again, the logical master database. I just want to show you a few things here. So at my master level, right, I have, you'll see those 2 admin accounts that I had shown in the portal, both my Entra auth account and my SQL admin account. And let's see, where do we see those new roles? I don't know if they show in Management Studio yet, but let's then compare and contrast that to one of our databases. So let's say I've created commerce databases for each of my regions that I have. This is, and note another thing I want to take you back to then. Remember back in my resource group. After I get past all of these things that I have open. Okay, if I go to that access control and I go to check access to see who has access to this resource. Let's say I maybe even sort down by type just to see specific users. Okay, so remember at this resource group level, I'm an owner and I have access. Remember my coworker, Jared, he has reader access to this resource group. If I go into the specific resource like the SQL Server, and I go to its access control, and I say view access to this resource, and I sort by, again, users. So here you can say Jared has a couple different levels of access on this SQL Server. He is a reader, which means he can view the resources in the resource group, and he is also a SQL Server contributor. So I have given Jared the ability to do things like view everything on the server, change settings on the server, to be able to do things with networking on the server, right? He could come in and create a new elastic pool, change transparent data encryption. But going into, again, my master database and my users, we don't see anything about a Jared Carney here. If I were to go into individual databases as well, there you would not see any of the I don't think we can view down to that level. We would have to do it via T-SQL, and I'm just not ready for that. But that is one big thing I wanted to point out to you here is, again, this is that true separation of duties between the Azure, that role-based administrator control access, and the SQL database, the SQL managed instance. Also something that if you're looking to implement Azure SQL and anyone on the security team raises these threats or these questions about how can we have the separation of duties? How can we make sure that, the infrastructure administrators are able to create and scale the resources, but only the app users are able to access the apps and the databases? You can now pull out all of your special knowledge on RBAC roles versus the SQL roles. So yeah, digging into this, my SQL Server and database example here. So let's dive in a little bit more into Kevin, our database administrator here. So on this SQL 49 US server, again, you've seen that there's a SQL admin login of SQL admin. We've also created, the Entra ID admin would be Kevin. And, I've created that commerce admin user, which you saw, which has database manager and database connector role. I've also given another user, Tamara, the database connector role. And again, best practice would be that these are actually groups, not users. Then how we could break this up to these 3 different databases that I have on this server, you'll notice that they all have SQL admin as a user in them, because again, SQL admin is the server level admin and thus becomes a user in all of the databases. Commerce admin, because it's the database manager and can create databases, is the one that created these databases. So it exists in each of these as well. But now from here, I can create separate both SQL authentication and Entra ID authentication users in each of them. So I can create separate Entra ID users for all of the different people that have all of the different roles in this database. And I can do the same thing in managed instance as well. So again, to show a SQL managed instance example, I might have a SQL admin login, would have an Entra ID admin login, can have that SQL login of commerce admin, which could be assigned very specific managed instance roles. But again, the difference with SQL database is these special roles that exist: the database manager, the database connector. And again, we could set up one user that exists at the server level and has access to all of them, or we can set up individual users in each database that are fully contained, that do not need access at the server or instance level.
So a question just came in from chat. For a
Okay.
SQL database, you had a sysadmin username. What did they have for permissions?
And so I assume that is this top one that's being asked about here, the SQL admin login. Which I called SQL admin. So to go back to this slide, it's full administrative permissions. There's just no true admin role that exists. So the SQL admin, or the top level admin for a SQL server, whether that is SQL authentication or Entra ID authentication, have the equivalent of sysadmin, but the role does not actually exist. But it's the equivalent. They can do anything and everything. And if that is not clear, Pat, please connect with me on Twitter or Blue Sky or LinkedIn. Send me a message, send me an email, something, and let me elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yep. No, comment was it is okay, good to go, and it was SQL
Okay.
admin.
Cool. All right. So when it comes then to setting up the Azure SQL authentication and authorization, again, we've talked about the fact that there are Azure RBAC roles, there are SQL RBAC roles, there are SQL admins, there are server level admins, database level logins. Before creating your resource group, before creating your first database, before creating your first server or managed instance, before creating your first resource group, this is a full-on governance exercise that should be gone through, right? You want to figure out which users or roles, particularly groups, will have which RBAC permissions at the subscription level and at the resource group level. And then within a resource group, what users, what groups have RBAC permissions for SQL Server contributor, SQL database contributor, SQL managed instance contributor, the SQL security contributor, if you want to use that as well. And again, remember, you can create custom roles, or your infra admins can create custom roles. Another big thing to decide on earlier rather than later is, do we use Entra authentication only, SQL authentication only, or some blended mix of both? Again, Entra authentication by default is more secure. It is recommended. Definitely try to get there if you can. And then again, you also want to determine your strategy for on the SQL Server in particular and the SQL database. Are you going to have all server level logins that correlate to users in those databases, or would you rather just have fully contained databases? So just some important questions to answer in your Azure journey. Again, just another recap slide. Control and data planes, SQL, Entra and SQL auth. Biggest thing here, principle of least permissions should always apply. We always want to give a group the least permissions possible, and we want to put a user in the lowest group that they possibly can. And the other recap that I did not put here, but I'm going to mention one more time, are Azure locks are your friend. And with that, that is the majority of my presentation and walkthrough on that. So I will hang out here for a couple more minutes in case there are any other questions or comments or thoughts on that.
All right. I'll give a moment for any of those to come in chat-wise. Mark says, nice job. I agree. This was a really good explanation.
Thank you. Thanks. It's something that, like, I've been using Azure probably 10 to 12 years now, and that level, like the Azure level, just never really bothered to think about it for a long time. Just I kind of was given rights in a subscription to what I may or may not have needed to do. And in the last couple of years, with the increased just focus on security overall, I became a lot more curious about this. And then in addition, helping some customers with setting up custom RBAC roles. I think it's really interesting, all of the different permissions and how granular you can get. I also think that it is different from being on premises, where like you get your Active Directory login and either someone does give you access to a server or they don't. Azure is a slightly different landscape with so many more types of resources, and it can be dizzying to go in and see all those things. And until you've seen that access control IAM screen and had it explained to you, I kind of looked at it the first few times like, I don't know where to go. So I hope this was helpful.
Yeah, it definitely was. And
awesome.
Looks like no questions in chat. So
okay.
I think we're going to wrap things up for this evening. Thank you so much, Jess, for presenting.
And thank you to everyone that took some time out of your day, no matter what time it is. I appreciate it. Feedback always welcome, again, via Twitter or LinkedIn or an email. So thanks. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.
All right. And with that, we're going to wrap things up for tonight. So until we see each other in a future meeting, remember next week we are in person. Check that out, meetup.com/TriPass. But until we do see each other in a future meeting, everybody, take care.